Well, it's time to go on with our conference and the second session. That's about the Middle Ages territorial scope. And once again, we are listening to three contributions. The first one is by Lucy Sackville. I try to speak English as far as I can, and to introduce Lucy Sackville, University of York, senior lecturer in the history of the Central Middle Ages in the Department of History at York. She was at Rome Fellow at the British School and Junior Research Fellow at Exeter College. Her researches are about medieval heresy and its repression for territories of Italy and southern France particularly. And about her works, I like to mention the book of 2011, Heresy and Heretics in the 13th Century, the Textual Representation. Well, Lucy, you have the floor, please.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? Am I audible? Can you hear me at all?
Yeah.
Oh, marvellous. Okay. I'm sorry. Hello from the big screen. This feels very strange, but hello. It's lovely to be here in the giant box on the wall. I'd really like to thank the organisers for inviting me. It's really exciting to talk in this kind of diachronic way. I think it's always really productive for asking questions. Thank you also for that very kind introduction. I am primarily a historian of southern France and a bit of northern Italy, so I'm not as familiar with Aragon, but I will do my best. I would also like to apologise. I'm just recovering from COVID, so this isn't as polished as I would like. And if I run out of breath, that's why I'm not just really overexcited. So I wanted to sort of talk about France and Aragon as a kind of territory which occupies a disproportionate amount of space, I think, in the scholarship of medieval Inquisition. That's certainly true of southern France in terms of volume, in terms of the framework for thinking about Inquisition in this period. And basically, this is going to overlap with a lot of Thomas's excellent paper, but in a much less elegant form. I think that territorial scope still defines the contours of scholarship in this period to some degree, especially the south of France predominates. And that means a lot of focus on Cathars. The Inquisition in Aragon sort of gets left to one side. What's going on in the Rhineland gets a bit overlooked, and the completely different timeline of Italian Inquisition is kind of left to one side. And I think in part that's to do with two main things. One is to do with the timing of Inquisition in these regions, and also to do with the survival of evidence. The regions are important because because that's where Inquisition happens very early. Anti-heretical policy is acted on by energetic ecclesiastical and secular agents, and it's acted on early. And as a result, this is where a lot of what becomes standard process is beginning to be formed. And when I'm talking about France, I'm really talking about the south. There are some Inquisitions going on in the north, and on those I would read Jessalyn Bird first because she's excellent. But the south is really the crucible, I think, for a lot of these tribunals, and partly because of the focus of the papacy on the south of France in terms of the crusade that takes place there, but also the reform of the episcopate by Innocent and the close involvement of the Cistercians, and then also, of course, the Order of Preachers. And so that's where the kind of tribunals are really established early, with a lot of episcopal involvement in the beginning, in the 1220s and 30s, in Toulouse and Narbonne and Albi and Tarragona in Aragon. And by the 1240s, there are huge tribunals underway processing a lot of people, interrogating and sentencing hundreds of people, whole villages at a time. And it's that volume, I think, and the number of iterations that it goes through that really embeds the process, and that's then exported in text and in personnel and in formulae. Aragon, and here I mean the Kingdom of Aragon, so also Valencia and Catalonia, Balearics, bits of the Pyrenees, is also somewhere where you see a lot of quite early anti-heretical tribunals, shall we say. And partly that's because of its proximity to Languedoc. It's partly because of the involvement of the Aragonese crown in the crusade in that period. But it does also receive a relatively high amount of papal attention. There's a lot of special measures and legations sent to Tarragona. The king is inviting quite a lot of this intervention, and that relationship continues through the papacies of Alex IV and Urban IV, all the way into the 1260s, excuse me. Also, like the south of France, the Dominicans are really in the ascendant here. They're very important in this work, particularly because of the presence of Raymond of Peñafort, who is, of course, one of the main theoreticians of early Inquisition, and also the kind of penitential tradition that underpins it. Also, as a kind of just worth pointing out, Aragon also has at the same time developing a really quite robust and interesting tradition of secular inquisitions, which is, bound up with Aragonese law and Roman and canon law, and that old kind of Frankish idea of the inquest, that pertains in a lot of those old Carolingian lands. So there is a kind of importance in this region which is to do with the early development, and because of those kind of early texts that it produced, a lot of the kind of legal texts that most historians of Inquisition in this period will work on are the kind of regional church councils that emerge in the wake of the Crusade in Languedoc, most of which are concerned with ensuring the maintenance of the peace through a focus on heresy. What that meant was a lot of local legislation, which then gets taken up and made into quite important foundation for later Inquisitions. Tarragona, in particular, in Aragon, in 1242, again, that's under the influence of Raymond of Peñafort, becomes canonical text, and there are people here who know much more about this than I do. So it's partly, it is an important place for the development of Inquisition, but it's also something which is overrepresented because of the volume of material that survives. And a lot of that is, well, it's partly to do with the number of Inquisitions, but it's also to do with just accident of survival, the very good Dominican archival instincts, the 17th century scientific enterprises that saw the preservation of a lot of those archives means that the volume of material that we have for this region is just vast compared to some other places, and all collected in one place as well. So it exerts a kind of gravitational pull, I think, on the scholarship, and also, therefore, its methodological habits kind of go with that. One effect of that, I think, is chronological, because the majority of Inquisition in that region took place in the 13th century. It tends to distort the chronology. So Bailey and Field have talked about the problems that has for work on later Inquisitions. It leaves the kind of early 14th century as a kind of appendage to the 13th rather than something which is part of an ongoing development. So I kind of wanted to think about just kind of general currents in scholarship for these regions and some of the implications for that. And also the way in which work is starting to move beyond the kind of habits of thought that we've been used to. The first thing I want to talk about, something that Thomas has also raised, is this question of Inquisition as a kind of machinery, I guess. Most people working on medieval Inquisition are, in this region anyway, are historians of heresy. This is the direction that they're coming at it from. And in recent decades, that has meant a focus on Inquisition as a mode of religious or social control. And Thomas has already outlined how tenacious that idea is. No, it's not necessarily incorrect, but that has tended to dominate the conversation. Most of the focus tends to be on Catharism and its reality. Historians of this region run a spectrum from heresy as coherent church to heresy as fabrication, although very few people, I think, are actually occupying the extremes of those ends. I think most people are somewhere in the middle. A large part of that skepticism about heresy in this region and what that might have been in reality is born out of the study of Inquisition records. The advent of Inquisition abruptly changes the landscape of the sources that we have for heresy in this period. Suddenly there's lots more information than there was before on heretical activity, on anti-heretical activity, and I don't think it's unreasonable to argue that Inquisition changes the nature of both of those things. But it creates this kind of discontinuity in the availability of material. Instead of relying on narrative or homiletic texts, we're suddenly presented with a very large volume of systematically gathered and comparable material. And a large effect of that is methodological, because the study of those records as evidence for heresy has really placed focus on the nature of their production, on the nature of the knowledge that they did produce. So much of the conversation revolves around the epistemological character of Inquisition texts. If you look at recent conferences, relatively recent in UCL and in the Club de Frangeau, which have discussed precisely this question. And I think we sort of take that for granted now. There is a healthy mistrust of what is presented by these registers, and I don't have a problem with that. I think that's good. I think unmaking that assumption that they are transparent documents is important, but it does tend to foreground the question of what underlies that construction, and that conversation tends to be about, well, what is the agenda underlying these? And that's played a large part in a more general move to see heresy in this period as a construct. And that has been the instinctive habit for reading Inquisition records produced in this region. The conversation's moved towards, or has been on, the machinery, the mechanics of repression, the power dynamic that it entrenches or maintains. And that's really important work. It looks at Inquisition as a means of social control, something that is operating according to an agenda of control. Thomas has mentioned, his own work, Gibbon's work, Arnold's work, all these, a lot of really excellent work on this stuff. But it also means there's a focus on the motives for that control in terms of the local environment. So I just wanted to think about some of the ways in which work is sort of building on that or moving onwards from that. Some of the work that we've been doing in York on the very early tribunals has been thinking about how to address one of the issues that habit creates, which is to do, again, with chronology. A lot of the scholarship on 13th century France sees this, that there is this kind of idea that the 13th century is the kind of golden age of medieval Inquisition, and before you get this kind of gap that moves on to the early modern. And that has problems for the later period, as I've said, which Bailey and Field have highlighted. But it also has issues creates issues for the study of the earlier phases. That methodology is born out of a mature Inquisition, basically, a reading of those sources, which is possibly less appropriate for the earlier phases, even though those earlier phases are part of why the region is so important. That you can't necessarily read those early texts in the same way as later records. It's a very tempting habit because that methodology is so sophisticated and so well worked out. But the early registers are produced before a tradition of heresy inquisitions is established, before the circulation of models, procedure and texts across region, before a developed conversation about Inquisition between inquisitors. They're working and writing before a formalised procedure had really been put in place. So it also predates those schematic descriptions of developed inquisitorial texts, which you get later from the mid-century onwards. So that corpus of knowledge that is maintaining the subjects that they're interrogating is not yet coherent, or if it is, it's more connected to legal and penitential conversations rather than inquisitorial. I would say similarly also the scale and continuity that's necessary to position Inquisition process as a repressive machinery doesn't exist at this stage. They're individual tribunals conducted by individual inquisitors working with really quite a large degree of autonomy. And whilst later that autonomy is informed by a shared inquisitorial culture, here they're sort of making it up as they go along to a certain degree. And given the importance of tribunals in this region for the later developments, it's important to understand their character without the weight of that later development, insofar as that's possible. Ooh, sorry. So the other kind of point I wanted to raise was something which has also been kind of emerging out of that habit, which is to look at how Inquisition intersected with other forces in the region. Again, something that Thomas has already spoken to. If we can characterise work in these regions in terms of an interpretive tendency, we can also look at a common strand in that scholarship on France and to a lesser degree on Aragon in this period is its focus on local entanglement. This has been particularly true of the relationship with political environment. Jean-Louis Viget, Julien Thierry, Bob Moore, when he deals with Inquisition, they're all interested in looking at how the functioning of that office is tied up with local political interests. And that's been a feature for Languedoc with, for a while now, but it's been picked up in ways which are now looking not only to what that means for heresy, but also what that means for Inquisition. So the work of Jean Fourier on the huge mid-40s tribunals, which is applying network analysis to that corpus of material, and suggesting that the web of relationships that can be constructed through that analysis show the tribunal is the ways in which it's bound up with the kind of civic rivalries of Toulouse, for example. I mean, he's doing a lot more than that. The close involvement with royal government has also been a feature of recent work on Aragon. Damien Smith points out the confederate nature of the crown means that the king is very involved in an alliance with the church and using Inquisition as a way to underscore his political authority. As I've mentioned, there's also a secular tradition of Inquisition, which I think is probably less looked at in connection with these Inquisitions. Political involvement in Aragon has also been shown to be tied up with the targeting of Jewish apostates, which for Inquisition in this region is much more a concern than heretics. And that led again to jurisdictional tensions with the crown. So there's a lot of stuff which is looking to kind of local entanglement, but I think for these regions it tends to be the kind of political networks. And I think what would be useful would be more along the lines of work that's being done for Italy by Benedetti and Parmeggiani and Catabruschi, looking at the kind of institutional bureaucratic networks of expertise that inquisitors are operating within. Because it's really obvious looking at these early texts how important local knowledge is. The inquisitors are having to work very closely with local authorities on and off throughout the 13th century, particularly at the beginning. Public knowledge, local knowledge, pharma is central to the way that these inquisitions work, because especially in the early phases, they don't have that archive of material that they can make reference to. They have to work on what they can glean from conversations. And that local system of knowledge and acquaintance is the basis for a lot of this kind of really interesting network analysis that's being done, not only by Rare, but also by Delphine to Isabel, building on Andrew Roach's work, and work by Davis Viral at his project. I know he's going to talk about that tomorrow, so I won't go into that. So I just wanted to kind of end by thinking a bit about this question of overarching narratives, or whether there is a kind of overarching narrative. I think one effect of the sustained focus on the local has been increasing questions over the effectiveness of Inquisition, or perhaps the importance of Inquisition, and I think that's been quite important. Don Frudlow's work on this period in this region suggests that that localized, sporadic nature of these Inquisitions meant that they were not actually that effective as a means of social control, and also that they're possibly less important than later counter-narratives would suggest. Biget has also suggested that then Inquisition was not as important, or not as important in the way that we might think. He shows how revolts against Inquisition are actually quite few and relatively ephemeral, and that there was actually quite a wide degree of acceptance. Although there's a really interesting recent conference in Nottingham, which is a really good set of essays which are about resistance and evasion and non-compliance. But yeah, I think unmaking that idea that Inquisition is necessarily this kind of monolithic machine is really important. Damien Smith has suggested that it was much less effective in Aragon than the creation of what he calls a caritative society, in terms of its aims against heresy anyway. I think there are also advantages in remembering and extending the significance of this fragmentary nature in terms of seeing the early phases in this region in terms of their circumstance, and not only in terms of their later significance. In particular, I think it's quite difficult to point to an overarching programme, given the unease that a lot of people working in this region have about the institutional or homogenous character of Inquisition. We need to be asking what grounds they might have had a homogenous agenda, what coherent idea it is that they are applying. I think it frees the study of Inquisition, of heresy, from a focus on a repressive agenda, not that they didn't have one, but and allows for a sort of reconnection with other potentially useful contexts. So religious history, for example. I think the preoccupation with trying to trying to disaggregate what inquisitors are doing from the idea of a kind of coherent dissenting belief system has meant that some of the actual religious aspects of Inquisition have been overlooked to a certain degree. And some of the most interesting work, I think, on Inquisition in these regions has been to reconnect it to the larger religious and vocational phenomena, particularly the close connection with the order of preachers, thinking about that big collection, Praedicatores Inquisitores, and the work of Rainini and Canetti, and also recently Christine Caldwell-Ames, show how Inquisition was sort of tied into a wider evangelizing mission. BJ again would suggest that to a certain degree, Inquisition and the way that the Dominicans run it is an integral part of the social fabric of Languedoc, in fact, and it's much more important in terms of community cohesion rather than repression. Tartikoff has argued similar lines for Aragon, that the concern with Jewish apostates is something which can also be tied up with missionizing efforts, and that again aligns with a kind of vocational history. I would suggest also, to echo something Thomas said, what would be useful for this region is a similar reconnection to legal cultures, for want of a better word. So the kind of work that Brisky's done on the Familia, Scharf has done for the communes, Riccardo's excellent work on Florence and the Concilia, that intersection with everyday legal and bureaucratic cultures, I think, is really important, and I think would be useful to be done in this region. Inquisition is part of a wider move away from ordeal to witness, whether that's documentary or personal. It's part of a wider phenomenon that's changing the legal understanding of evidence, and I think that would be a useful place to think about it. Jörg Feuchter has done some work on this already. And that kind of connection to secular Inquisition would be really useful. Kage's work on Aragonese secular inquisitions would be very useful, I think, to think with. So, in short, I think Inquisition in this region is because it's mostly worked on by historians of heresy, and concerned with the nature of that heresy, has placed a focus on the development of process and the dynamics of power. And part of that has meant there's an interest in how the tribunal intersects with local politics and the study of individual trials. But that can be expanded. The benefit of that fragmentary nature is expanding now to show how that is freed from kind of internally directed repressive agenda, to see how it is more properly part of different larger phenomena, which I think could provide more useful contexts, so religious history, legal history, intellectual history, which might also then offer a counterweight to the vast disproportion of material that we have for this region if we only concentrate on Inquisition records. That's all I've got to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Lucy, for your contribution about this area, so central for the development of our problems, I would say. Now it's time to listen to Riccardo Parmeggiani. Thank you, Riccardo. I try to introduce Riccardo, who is famous abroad too, but for the English speakers too. Riccardo Parmeggiani teaches at the University of Bologna, and his studies are about heretics, Inquisition, and mendicant orders. He is a member of the Deputazione di Storia Patria per le Province di Romagna and the Istituto per la Storia della Chiesa di Bologna, for the Institute for the Church History of Bologna, of the Church of Bologna, and member of the Scientific Committee of Archivum Fratrum Predicatorum, documenta riviste internazionali di studi filologici, storico-filologici sulle fonti, and so on, many other things. And about his works, I would like to mention L'Inquisizione a Firenze nell'età di Dante, already mentioned before, i consiglia procedurali per l'Inquisizione medievale, Bologna 2011, e il vescovo e il capitolo, il cardinale Niccolò Albergati e i canonici di San Pietro a Bologna. Prego Riccardo, a te la parola.
Grazie Marco, thank you. First of all, I want to apologize to speak in Italian. I will try to speak slowly, and I've prepared a quite simple text in Italian language, hoping to be better understood.
Non si escucha, non si escuta.
Il primo e più risalente punto di partenza del mio intervento, qui assunto come termine post quem, è rappresentato dalla discussione La parola all'accusa, l'inquisitore nei risultati della recente storiografia, pubblicata da Daniele Solvi per la rivista Studi Medievali nel 1998. Non senza rammarico, lo studioso sottolineava come prima di allora, salvo che per il periodo delle origini, cito, la ricerca sull'Inquisizione, quando i tempi erano maturi, al momento cioè di spiccare il salto dalla descrizione all'interpretazione delle fonti disponibili, non è riuscita ad acquisire una dimensione autonoma, restando fagocitata in una prospettiva che da sempre la contraddistingue, ausiliaria nei confronti dell'eresiologia. Fine della citazione. Era allora ancora fresca di stampa la sostanziale ripubblicazione nel 1996 di una precedente monografia del 1954 dell'ormai anziano frate cappuccino Mariano Dalati, dedicata all'Inquisizione francescana nell'Italia centrale del 200. Uscita editoriale precorsa un decennio prima dalla raccolta di saggi in 2 volumi su eretici inquisitori in Italia, dal 2 al 400. Questi lavori, comunque meritori, chiudevano idealmente una lunga stagione in cui l'approccio al tema repressivo, come evidenziato anche da Grado Giovanni Merlo, era rimasto a lungo terreno quasi esclusivo, tanto per gli studi quanto per l'edizione di fonti, di studiosi organici agli ordini, da Livario Soliger ad Antoine Dondin, da Gero di Fossenegger a Celestino Piano, da Ilarino da Milano a Mariano Dalati, per non citare quei principali. Ben presto un importante contributo al risveglio dell'interesse storiografico attorno all'Inquisizione medievale italiana sarebbe giunto non più da singoli, ma da istituzioni organiche o comunque vicine alla stessa sfera, in quanto tangenti, almeno in parte più o meno preponderante, l'ambito geografico della penisola, non si possono non ricordare gli importanti convegni promossi nel primo decennio del nuovo millennio dall'Istituto Storico Domenicano, con il primo di una serie di 4 convegni dal titolo Predicatores Inquisitores, avviata nel 2002 con una prima iniziativa dedicata all'Inquisizione medievale. Così come non si può non sottolineare l'importanza dell'incontro assisiate del 2005 sul tema Frati minori e Inquisizione, promosso dalla Società Internazionale di Studi Francescani. Già in parte a monte, ma soprattutto a valle della rassegna curata da Daniele Solvi, Lorenzo Paolini e Grado Giovanni Merlo pubblicavano saggi innovativi sull'Inquisizione medievale italiana. Se ne darà in parte conto più avanti, ma soprattutto negli atti. Saggi qui inclusi raccolti di lavori personali. All'Ufficio Fidei, il primo, Paolini, consacrava la seconda parte del volume dedicata alle Piccole Volpi, chiese ed eretici nel Medioevo, uscita nel 2013, mentre il secondo, Merlo, nel 2008 dava alle stampe Inquisitori e Inquisizione del Medioevo, nella cui premessa è espressa una proposta metodologica radicalmente innovativa, sostanzialmente ribaltando quell'endiadi invariabile eretici inquisitori in inquisitori ed eretici. Cito da Merlo. In una storia dell'Inquisizione, la coppia storica e storiografica non può più essere eretici e inquisitori, bensì invertendo l'ordine delle parole, deve essere inquisitori ed eretici. Nonostante che quest'ultima coppia storica abbia offerto una propria validità euristica nell'ambito delle ricerche di storia religiosa, inquisitori e inquisizione medievali possono e devono essere oggetto di studio anche di per sé e in sé, vale a dire indipendentemente dallo studio degli eretici. Fine della citazione. Nello stesso 2008 usciva in consonanza un'elaborazione monografica di saggi ad opera di Marina Benedetti, dedicata agli inquisitori lombardi nel 200, in cui gli eretici vengono volontariamente colti di riflesso, principalmente nelle fonti contabili dell'ufficio. Vi torneremo, benché brevemente. Alla stessa studiosa si deve in tempi recenti il secondo punto storiografico a cui accennavo in apertura, coincidente con il saggio Eresie e Inquisizioni, osservazioni storiografiche, metodologiche e edizioni di fonti, pubblicato 2 anni or sono nei quaderni di storia religiosa medievale. È un numero, il primo di 2 numeri monografici, mi pare, che raccolgono gli interventi presentati a un importante consiglio veronese sul passaggio dal Medioevo cristiano alla storia religiosa del Medioevo nel quarantennio precedente al 2014. L'affermazione assolutamente condivisibile per cui, cito, eresia e inquisizione sono 2 settori di ricerca separati, dà l'idea dello scarto maturato nell'arco di un ventennio rispetto alla quasi invariabile subordinazione della seconda alla prima. Andrebbe qui certamente sottolineato come una simile dinamica si sviluppi in parallelo con il consolidamento di una sempre più nutrita corrente scettica, tra virgolette, circa la reale consistenza di una forma o fenomenologia organica di eresia, ma non si vuole naturalmente ricadere in vecchie impostazioni del binomio, fortunatamente superate. Tra i molti temi di interesse del contributo di Marina Benedetti, mi preme sottolineare, nella prospettiva del nostro incontro, la constatazione del tutto evidente di un netto ritardo della medievistica italiana sulla percezione della portata del fenomeno repressivo, con ripercussioni che travalicano l'esclusiva e spesso angusta prospettiva religiosa nella quale si presupporrebbe di confinare il tribunale della fede. Cito dalla Benedetti. Nella medievistica italiana non si scorge ancora una specifica sensibilità per un importante ambito di studi sull'Inquisizione. Addirittura si coglie una sorta di diffidenza, la medesima rivolta ai medievisti specialisti di storia religiosa. Verrebbe anche da dire che solo con grande difficoltà viene colta l'evidente pervasività dell'officium fidei nella società medievale, in ambito economico, politico, istituzionale, oltre che come ovvio religioso, da cui si tende a prendere le distanze, mossi forse anche da preconcetti che non bisognerebbe esitare a definire ideologici. Chiude la citazione. Basterebbe qui ricordare le riflessioni di studiosi transalpini del calibro di Sylvain Piron e Jacques Chiffolo a proposito degli officia fidei di Firenze e Padova, per comprendere la miopia di una prospettiva condizionata da concorrenze, anche nel senso etimologico, di settori accademici scientifico-disciplinari, obbedendo a logiche piuttosto burocratiche anziché scientifiche. Un'altra conseguenza negativa prodotta dalla vigente valutazione della ricerca in ambito medievistico italiano è la paradossale svalutazione delle edizioni di fonti, che incontrano, per usare un eufemismo, una scarsa premialità. Nonostante l'opportuno richiamo alla necessità di un ritorno proprio alle fonti, che per loro natura, lo sottolinea sempre Marina Benedetti, si aprono ad uno studio sulla diacronia, anch'essa spesso assunta dalla valutazione dei medievisti quale criterio di qualificazione negativa, che strizzerebbe l'occhio piuttosto all'approccio del vicino settore dei cristianisti, tra virgolette, piuttosto poco, anche sul versante delle edizioni, si fa. Per prendere ancora una volta la rassegna di Solvi come punto di partenza, i lavori di edizione sono rari e quasi assenti, se si accettano i processi inquisitoriali di Milano contro i devoti di Guglielma, di Marina Benedetti, che ha studiato poi anche editato i processi valdesi dell'area alpina del 400, ma ne parleremo dopo, e alcuni testi procedurali, tra cui il più antico manuale italiano, l'Explicatio Super Officio Inquisitionis, pubblicata da chi vi parla una decina di anni fa. In tempi più recenti, e significativamente ad opera di uno studioso estraneo al contesto accademico, Renzo Fantapiè ha proposto con il volume Eresia e Inquisizione a Prato, secoli XII e XIV, un vero e proprio codice diplomatico della repressione antiereticale nella città toscana. L'edizione, che sconta in vero alcune criticità, ha tra i vari meriti quello di evidenziare l'eterogeneità di sede conservativa delle scritture inquisitoriali. Sono temi ancora una volta cari a Marina Benedetti, le cui ricerche sul libro degli inquisitori aprono stimolanti squarci sullo studio del contenitore, oltre che del contenuto, e della sua storia, quale oggetto di studio autonomo o comunque preliminare all'analisi della documentazione che vi è conservata. Lo studio delle scritture degli inquisitori, con prevalente attenzione alla realtà italiana, ha conosciuto una tappa importante con il numero monografico del 2002 dei quaderni di storia religiosa, ora quaderni di storia religiosa medievale, in cui la studiosa milanese si è occupata delle fonti contabili dell'ufficio, foriere di piste di ricerca polidirezionali. L'intuizione della centralità di questo genere di documentazione, poi ripresa da diversi specialisti anche d'Oltralpe, si deve al pionieristico saggio di Lorenzo Paolini del 1999 sulle finanze dell'Inquisizione in Italia, secoli XIII e XIV, che ha avuto il merito di porre al centro degli sviluppi della repressione le ricadute economiche della stessa, il cui condizionamento si avvertirà con la successiva emersione di scandali, poi l'origine di inchieste pontificie, la cosiddetta Inquisizionopoli, così l'ha definita Paolini negli anni in cui ancora era viva l'eco dei processi per Tangentopoli, riguardanti molte realtà dell'Italia centro-settentrionale. La straordinaria fonte del Liber Contractum Padovano, edita nel 2002, scrittura, o meglio testimonianza, non già prodotta dall'Inquisizione ma contro l'Inquisizione, documenta con plastica evidenza la collusione tra il titolare del tribunale e i vertici locali dell'ordine dei frati minori nell'ideazione e nell'attuazione di un sistema di fatto estorsivo ai danni delle istituzioni concorrenti nella gestione dei beni degli eretici, vale a dire del comune dell'Epistorio. I solidi legami strategici tra inquisitori e l'elite conventuale provinciale non sembrano palesarsi quale specifica caratteristica dell'Officium Veneto, ma svilupparsi in diversi contesti della penisola, concordemente con l'individuazione di un profilo dell'inquisitore sempre meno corrispondente a quello di uno specialista della repressione, quasi potesse considerarsi uno sbocco, per così dire, esclusivo di per sé connotante, ma di un frate pienamente inserito nei circuiti locali, nell'intercambiabilità di ruoli e cariche che sembra caratterizzare, specie ma non solo per i tribunali italiani a guida minoritica, quella che Sylvain Piron ha definito con riferimento a Firenze una vera e propria élite inamovibile. Un simile rilievo, coniugato con la riconosciuta centralità del ruolo dell'inquisitore, titolare, sempre per dirla con lo studioso transalpino, de la charge plus convoitée en raison des gains qu'elle permet, ha spinto, proprio in relazione alla città di Dante, ad affondi prosopografici che hanno disvelato, dietro un altrimenti arido cognome toponomastico, significative appartenenze familiari riconducibili al coda dell'imprenditoria bancaria toscana. Studi solo apparentemente eccentrici la realtà repressiva, penso al dettagliato quadro dei lettori padovani, con articolate schede biografiche proposte da Emanuele Fontani, poco meno di 10 anni fa nel volume Frati, Libri e Insegnamento nella provincia minoritica di Sant'Antonio, secoli XIII-XIV, dimostrano tuttavia quanto sarebbe in parte fuorviante, anche per quanto si è detto poc'anzi, schiacciare sulla sola dimensione finanziaria il profilo dei frati inquisitori italiani, che spesso ricoprirono importanti ruoli didattici in seno agli ordini, denotando interessi culturali decisamente non circoscrivibili nell'orizzonte della polemistica o della repressione antireticale, ma piuttosto aperti ad una pluralità di saperi. Se ne ha ora una plastica evidenza nel catalogo dei possessori di codice del convento fiorentino di Santa Croce, appena pubblicato in occasione di un'importante mostra del centenario dantesco. Sul complesso dell'Inquisizione medievale italiana mancano organiche opere di sintesi. Le uniche due eccezioni, in realtà ce ne sarebbe una terza, un lavoro uscito oggi, no, non l'ho appena saputo, per parte di Marina sul Medioevo inquisitoriale, giusto Marina? Almeno fino ad oggi le uniche due eccezioni di sintesi sull'Inquisizione medievale italiana sono rappresentate dal fortunato volume che tocca la realtà medievale di Andrea del Colle, pubblicato nel 2006 e più volte ristampato, intitolato L'Inquisizione in Italia dal XII al XXI secolo, e il recente studio del 2019 di Jill Moore su Inquisition and its Organization in Italy 1250-1350. Se la prima opera, quella di Del Colle, con una stimolante scelta di taglio diacronico, si deve ad un modernista, autore di una buona opera di divulgazione di lavori altrui, per quanto concerne la parte medievale, la seconda propone, attraverso un'indagine articolata, in parte ben documentata, risultati a suo dire innovativi, che assumendo in senso critico quale pietra di paragone un noto studio di Richard Kiefer, restituirebbero per l'area italiana una traduzione su un piano istituzionale dell'ufficio repressivo, conclusione raggiunta espungendo volontariamente dal panorama delle fonti utilizzate quelle relative alla procedura, manuali e consigli. A conferma di un evidente ostacolo linguistico nell'approcciare lo studio dei tribunali della fede della penisola, e ad esempio ignorata parte della più recente storiografia in lingua italiana, a conclusione analoga è raggiunto quasi 20 anni fa, proprio attraverso la valorizzazione della manualistica Lorenzo Paolini, la cui intuizione è stata ripresa dagli allievi in studi successivi. Lo studioso bolognese ha sottolineato nella prospettiva dell'istituzionalizzazione dell'officium il ruolo chiave esercitato dalla Dextirpanda di Innocenzo IV del 1252, lettera che, come è noto, faceva seguito all'assassinio di frate Pietro da Verona, uno dei pochi inquisitori su cui, ad eccezione su scala minore per numero di interventi, di Raniero da Piacenza e pochi altri, si è concentrato una specifica attenzione da parte della storiografia, non solo di lingua italiana, penso a Pradlo, su Pietro da Verona si è occupato anche il presidente della sezione, si è occupato Marina, c'è anche uno studio in corso di Alessia Trivelloni. Però sono eccezioni. Di norma il profilo di singoli inquisitori, se non per casi particolarmente eclatanti, non è oggetto di specifica attenzione. Secondo studi recenti, proprio a partire dalla lettera di Papa Fieschi, la guida dell'Inquisizione della penisola sarebbe gradualmente e impercettibilmente scivolata dal pieno controllo del papato, dopo peraltro l'isolato e studiato tentativo di coordinamento ad opera del sovennante Inquisitor Generalis, Giovanni Gaetano Orsini, prende la citazione da Bennett, che se ne è occupato anche qui quindi passando dal piano del controllo papale a quello dei frati, i quali di fatto avrebbero plasmato un modello repressivo, peraltro non unitario, in quanto condizionato dalla peculiarità delle dinamiche proprie dei contesti locali, oltre che dalla soggettività dei diversi titolari del tribunale. Per verificare qual era al meglio una simile dinamica, sono fondamentali gli studi su quello che fu l'entourage dei titolari del Tribunale della Fede, con primi significativi risultati riguardo allo sviluppo della famiglia, cui ha dedicato meno di 10 anni fa un importante saggio Caterina Bussi. Tra i componenti, oltre a varie figure, tra cui i consultori, da loro oggetto di specifica attenzione storiografica, spiccano per importanza i notai, autentici perni dei tribunali, garanti di una continuità istituzionale altrimenti interrotta dal frequente avvicendarsi di diversi inquisitori per i singoli uffici. Presente un caso fiorentino di 2 notai che coprono di fatto mezzo secolo, nel quale si avvicendano, non mi ricordo se 7 o 9 inquisitori, per dare un'idea del rapporto. Poi ogni tribunale fa storia a sé, ovviamente ci sono aree in cui gli inquisitori hanno titolarità ben più lunghe. I notai rappresentano peraltro un fondamentale anello di congiunzione con gli ufficiali al servizio del giudice della fede, i 12 viri proviet cattolici con compiti polizieschi previsti dalla Dextirpanda, fruitori di 1/3 dei beni confiscati agli eretici. Questo rilievo, con il conforto dei primi sondaggi e lo sviluppo di studi per la prima età moderna, penso allo studio di Denny Solera, suggerisce l'opportunità di indagare il profilo dei membri di questo corpo. In base ai dati finora noti, figure di rilievo nei contesti sociopolitici delle comunità cittadine, penso per esempio agli ufficiali fiorentini che hanno un'estrazione massiccia dal rango magnetizio. Alla luce di queste scarne e rapide considerazioni, tenendo conto della varietà e della specificità dei contesti nell'Italia comunale, appare in tutta evidenza la necessaria declinazione al plurale della parola inquisizione, anche all'interno dei confini della penisola, non solo su base provinciale, ma anche su scala locale. La crescente e rilevata discrezionalità degli inquisitori italiani nel piegare la procedura ai fini desiderati, spesso rispondenti a specifiche dinamiche interne alle società locali, dinamiche solidarie o positive, spinge ad allargare le ricerche in chiave comparativa, soprattutto sul piano della sincronia. Dovendo concludere per il necessario rispetto dei tempi e scusandomi per la necessaria frammentarietà della mia esposizione, sottolineo ancora una volta come siano molti i temi degli studiosi non nominati, che saranno presenti negli atti e con ben maggior dettaglio. Non ho ad esempio accennato agli importanti studi di Andrea Padovani e soprattutto Thomas Scharf sulla presenza e sull'inserzione spesso contrastata della normativa antiereticale pontificia negli statuti cittadini, con controversie spesso all'origine di forme di aperta resistenza al radicamento dell'Inquisizione nei tessuti urbani, avvertiti come una forma di minaccia rispetto all'autonomia cittadina. Proprio le opposizioni, non di rado violente, sono state oggetto di occasionali approfondimenti, evidenziando, ma si attendono novità dalla prossima pubblicazione degli atti del convegno lionese Résister à l'Inquisition del 2018, quanto il sentimento di avversione al Tribunale della Fede si sia frequentemente riverberato sulla famiglia religiosa di cui titolare l'espressione. Si pensi anche agli echi di opere letterarie, quali il Fiore e il Decameron di Boccaccio, recentemente approfondite in questa direzione da Antonio Montefusco e Justin Steinberg. Non ho accennato, tra l'altro, perché l'ha fatto Irene nella sua bella relazione, alla presenza, al peso dei processi politici di fatto promossi dal pontefice vignolese, soprattutto da Giovanni XXII, così non ho accennato a un altro importante tema tra i tanti altri, vale a dire quello delle relazioni tra l'autorità pontificia e la periferia, le sedi locali. Concludo. Quello che più complessivamente appare chiaro con ogni evidenza è il rivitalizzarsi di un significativo interesse storiografico attorno all'Inquisizione italiana, ora con l'allargamento a quel secolo cerniera tra Medioevo ed età moderna che fu il 400. Andrebbero qui almeno citati, per limitarsi alla monografia, gli studi di Michael Tabuzzi e Marina Benedetti, con un doveroso accenno ad alcuni saggi di Tamar Herzig. Gli auspici per future ricerche sembrano, semplificando, doversi inquadrare su coordinate spazio-temporali per certi versi opposti. Da un lato, individuando specifiche realtà da studiarsi anche nelle singole fonti sulla diacronia, dall'altro, con rovesciamento di prospettiva, mantenendo sull'asse della sincronia indagini dal carattere policentrico. Grazie.
Grazie Riccardo per i molti stimoli per un territorio anch'esso abbastanza centrale, direi, in particolare nel primo secolo per la particolare organizzazione politica in via di sviluppo che sappiamo e per la vicinanza con la sede apostolica, almeno per il primo secolo. Ma credo che ci sarà anche tempo per discutere ed eventualmente porre questioni su questo tema. Now we go on with Patrick Hornbeck. Fordham University after his studies at the University of Oxford. Hornbeck studies focus on Lollard movement, but they reached contemporary categories too with American Roman Catholicism and with this phenomenon of deconversion among Roman Catholics. Among his works, his studies, I remember the development of heresy, doctrinal variation in English Lollard descent, and more recently, Wikified Spirituality, 2013. Patrick, you have the floor.
Buon pomeriggio e grazie davvero per l'invito a partecipare a questa conferenza, all'incontro iniziale della rete Inquire. Sono onorato di essere qui e porto i saluti dei miei colleghi a Fordham University di New York. Potresti essere interessato a sapere che Fordham ospita il più antico centro accademico per lo studio del cristianesimo ortodosso negli Stati Uniti. Non vedo l'ora di condividere con I miei colleghi l'annunzio del secondo incontro di questa rete. Mentre ho studiato la lingua italiana per un anno all'università, mi scuso di non avere le competenze per consegnare questa tesina interamente in italiano e pertanto passerò all'inglese. I want to express my deep gratitude to the members of this conference for the invitation to join you and wish I could be there in person in Bologna this evening. What I'd like to do this evening is to spend some time talking about three main trends in the historiography of the Wycliffite or Lollard heresy of late medieval England. I'll mention each of them first, and then I'll go back and say a little bit more about each of them in turn. So the first theme I want to highlight is that no one believes that she or he is a heretic. That's an epithet or a term that's imposed upon a person by someone else. And in the few cases where it's imposed by someone on herself or himself, it's often in the form of something like irony or protest, something that today we might call reclaimed language. Second, a theme I want to touch on is that it's very difficult to determine what a person who's been accused of heresy actually believes. And our colleague Lucy touched on that a few minutes ago in her wonderful presentation. In many cases, we can see those accused of heresy only through the eyes of their persecutors. And third, I want to point out that the study of European heresies has, at least in my view, been for too long modeled on the linguistics and cultural confines of our modern day, rather than thinking about the linguistic and cultural forms that existed during the Middle Ages. And it seems to me that we commit an error, and in fact, we reinscribe the assumptions of our modern world when we read them back into the ecclesiastical culture of the 14th, 15th, and early 16th centuries. I don't know how much people at this conference are familiar with the story of the Lollard or Wycliffite heretics of late medieval England. So let me just, by way of introduction, spend a few minutes orienting you to this particular area of study. John Wycliffe was an Oxford philosopher and theologian, likely born in the early 1300s. He died in 1384. But in 1381, he was effectively forced into retirement from his position at the University of Oxford because of controversies concerning his position on the sacrament of the Eucharist. 150 years later, English reformers, including most famously John Bale and then John Fox, began to refer to Wycliffe as the so-called morning star of the Reformation. Wycliffe was these Protestant reformers' best answer to the question, where was your church before Luther? Of course, that's a disputed historical question. I'll come back to it in a minute, because John Wycliffe was first and foremost a theologian and philosopher of the late medieval schools. He was not someone who would have been comfortable with the linguistic or theological formulations of people like Martin Luther and John Calvin. But Wycliffe certainly was an influence on the Czech or Bohemian reformer Jan Hus, and Luther himself cited Hus as an influence on himself. So perhaps there's a genealogy there for us to attend to. As I mentioned, Wycliffe was removed and silenced from Oxford in 1381. His positions began to be condemned formally in 1382. He died in 1384, and 17 years later, England began burning heretics, people that they began to refer to as Lollards or Wycliffites. It wasn't until 1415 that the Council of Constance condemned both Wycliffe and his later disciple Hus, and it wasn't until 1428 that Wycliffe's bones, which had been buried peacefully in the churchyard of his parish in Leicestershire, were dug up and burned more than 30 years after the fact. If you fast forward nearly a century, Lollards have, by the 1520s, begun to merge into other reform movements as ideas from Lutherans in Germany and others on the mainland European continent come to reach England. I want to make one observation, and this builds on something several speakers at this conference have already mentioned, which is that I think it's important for those of us who study Inquisition, heresy, and the repression of heresy to think about the places in the contemporary university where our studies take place. And the study of Wycliffism or Lollardy is perhaps a little distinctive in this regard, because most scholars of Wycliffism or Lollardy exist in departments of English literature. They've been formed as scholars who study manuscripts, who study texts and codices, who are interested in the transmission of certain bodies of text from one generation to another. And I note that by contrast, those who often study heresy and Inquisition in places like France and Aragon, or also in Italy, have been formed more in the methodology of historians, or ecclesiastical historians, or even theologians and philosophers. And there's a piece of this legacy that's worth attending to, because the reason this work on Wycliffism and Lollardy has taken place so often in departments of literature is because Wycliffe's followers, those who became called Lollards, were among the first lay women and men to write in the vernacular language, in English, rather than in Latin. And so as a result of that particular coincidence, the study of this particular movement, the Lollard or Wycliffite movement, has tended to be more textually based rather than more philosophically and theologically based. And I'm not here to say that one of those models is necessarily better than any other, but just to note that there are genealogies for each of us in the ways in which the study of a particular region or a particular set of ideas has taken place. So I want to go back to my three main points from a few minutes ago. The first one that I mentioned is that in general, no one chooses to set out to become a heretic. In fact, it's kind of built into the definition. If one is a heretic, one has obstinately rejected the teachings of the institutional church. But a person who's being accused of rejecting those teachings does so precisely because that person believes that the teachings of the institutional church have departed from the original faith of Christ, perhaps from the lifestyle of the apostles, perhaps from what was taught by early Christians. The person who is so often labeled a heretic by church authorities is eager to, or at least willing to see those same church authorities as the ones who have departed from orthodoxy or orthopraxy. I mentioned before that there are a few instances, and this is true with Lollardy and Wycliffism as well, of what we call reclaimed language, where a group chooses a word that has been used to denigrate them and begins to use that word to describe themselves. So this word Lollard in English, or in Middle English, Loller, L-O-L-L-E-R, which may derive yet again from a Dutch word, Lollard, perhaps someone who mumbles his prayers or someone who's lazy in the religious life. That's a word that was applied to these dissenting individuals as an epithet, as an insult. But in many of their texts, they begin to refer to themselves, and even more so, they begin to refer to Christ as a loller. One of the texts states that Christ lolled on the cross. And this is a way of reclaiming, as I mentioned before, the language that was used to denigrate or oppose the people who were condemned as heretics. But for me, I think the underlying question, and one that I'm not sure has been addressed up until the last 10 to 15 years, the underlying question is, what is the attraction of a belief system that could lead to a very painful death? Why is it that a person would risk her or his life by opposing the positions of the institutional church, by participating in secret or occult gatherings or conventicles? What is it that led a person to want to take this risk? And I want to note that in the historiography of Wycliffism and of Lollardy, as in the historiography of other European heretical movements, we so often dwell on the negative, that the putative heretic is a person who rejects the church's position on this, or denies the church's position on that. And of course, that is the language that inquisitors used. I'll come to this more in a few minutes, but inquisitors were interested in identifying where a person had said no to the teachings of the institutional church. But saying no, in my view, and in the view of recent scholarship, isn't enough to want to take the risk to put one's life on the line. So the question that's begun to be framed by scholars such as Fiona Somerset working here in the United States is what was the attraction of this belief system? What spiritual benefits did a person gain from embracing a form of Christianity that was so risky? And once we begin to approach the texts with those questions in mind, we stop looking for the kinds of controversial positions that might get a person in trouble with the inquisitors. And we start seeing things that we would see if we were studying the writings of saints or writings about saints. We begin to see a rich devotional life unfold among these so-called heretics, one in which they are interested in imitating Christ, one in which they are striving for spiritual simplicity, one in which they're looking out for the common good. And those are the sorts of values and the sorts of ideas that, in my view at least, might be worth a person putting her or his or her life on the line for. There's also something to be said about the value of community. And Lucy talked a few minutes ago about network analysis, and I think that the tools that have become available to us through the digital realm have enabled us to explore the networks and relationships among heresy defendants and communities of individuals more than we've ever been able to do before. In the UK, Maureen Jorkowski, and in Canada, Shannon McSheffrey, have pioneered this work when it comes to the study of Lollardy or Wycliffism, asking very specific and individualized questions about how one suspect or defendant got to know another suspect or defendant. Was it because they worked in the same industry? Was it because they were united with one another through bonds like matrimony, or maybe even godparenthood, which is something that I think has gone underexplored? Because it seems to me that if one is part of a religious minority where there is the prospect of severe punishment, the few things that may make it possible for a person to persevere in those beliefs is the presence of a community supporting that person and reinforcing that person's sense that in fact they are on the side of the orthodox. So network analysis is a hugely important tool that has become available to us in recent years and that's becoming increasingly prominent in the scholarship on Wycliffism and Lollardy. It is important to be careful, however, about this. And so, for instance, in the work that has been done on this particular heretical movement, there were some missteps or perhaps false starts a few decades ago with regard to the role that women played in communities of Wycliffites or Lollards. Indeed, there are several prominent women who were defendants, even some who were burned at the stake for heresy. And there were scholars who reached the conclusion that these women had assumed leadership roles in their communities because those leadership roles were denied to them by the institutional church. And that seems like a compelling and interesting hypothesis. But when you delve more deeply into the networks, what one finds out is that those women were married to men who were even more powerful in the heretical movement or the heretical group than they were. And so it's important to see the whole network operate, not to focus in on any one particular component of it. So that first theme, why would someone become a heretic, may be answered by adopting a new lens and thinking about the attractions of Wycliffite or Cathar or Waldensian or Alumbrado spirituality, rather than simply asking what doctrines a person denied. A second question I want to ask, and this too links back to Lucy's paper, is how do we determine what a heresy defendant or suspect actually believed? Lucy mentioned the challenges that exist when it comes to reading trial records, and I would recommend to all of you John Arnold's recent essay in the journal Past and Present, dealing with some of the methodological challenges that exist in this particular space. England is perhaps distinctive in comparison to the European mainland, in that there wasn't an institution of the Inquisition in England in the ways that previous speakers have talked about. So even though the canonical procedure of Inquisition was often followed, the procedure was followed by local bishops acting in their role as ordinaries or as visitors of their diocese. Occasionally, there were nationwide commissions set up, but that was the exception rather than the rule. And so, as I did in writing my first book entitled What is a Lollard? In order to see the whole range of beliefs that Wycliffites or Lollards held, it's necessary to go and read individual bishops' registers and the records of trials that are contained in those documents. Many people at this conference, I'm sure, know the methodological pitfalls that there are when it comes to reading a document like the record of a medieval heresy trial. Unlike our court proceedings today, these are not verbatim transcripts, of course, and very often the records were prepared in advance by a scribe who knew that he believed what the defendant would say in response to certain questions. And so the question becomes, and has been debated in the last 2 decades of scholarship on the English trial records, how do we acknowledge the limitations of those records while at the same time recognizing that we don't have very many other choices when it comes to learning what individual defendants believe? One of the resources that I've found most helpful in my scholarship is an insight from the French critical theorist René Girard. And Girard wrote in the prologue to his book, The Scapegoat, that a sign that something in an oppositional record or an adversarial record, sign that something may actually really be true, is when it's unexpected. If something is formulaic, or it seems like it's been said so many times before, the odds are that that may be a scribal stipulation or a scribal stereotype. But where someone says something unusual, where someone says something that doesn't seem to fit the pre-existing pattern, that's a place where we might hone in and say, perhaps this is a clue to what that individual, herself or himself, actually believed. So let me give you an example of that when it comes to the study of Lollardy or Wycliffism. As I mentioned, the theological idea that got John Wycliffe expelled from the University of Oxford was his heresy, or at least his heterodoxy with regard to the presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Now, Wycliffe himself taught that Christ was really present in the Eucharist. He just didn't teach that Christ was physically present in the Eucharist, or that transubstantiation occurred. And it's important here to note that when we read Reformation and post-Reformation categories back onto the Middle Ages, we get some fairly unusual results. Because many of us who are trained in the period of the 16th century and beyond want to ask questions like, did Wycliffe believe in consubstantiation? Did Wycliffe believe in something like a spiritual presence? And we have to understand medieval theologians, and I would argue also lay heresy suspects, on their own terms. And so Wycliffe would say about the Eucharist that Christ is really but spiritually present. Those two terms were not oppositional for him. That spiritual presence was real, but just real in a different way than physical presence. And that was sufficient, of course, for Wycliffe to be condemned and, as I mentioned, removed from his university post. What's fascinating is that a few decades on, after Wycliffe had passed away and after his first generation of academic disciples was no longer active, some of those who were suspect of heresy likewise said that transubstantiation did not occur, or likewise said that Christ was spiritually present. And perhaps they did in fact believe those things. But a minority of individuals went one step farther and said that Christ's presence in the Eucharist was purely figurative, that the Eucharist was merely a commemoration of what had happened at the Last Supper and did not involve any presence of Christ whatsoever. And so when inquisitors note that particular belief, we have to assume, or I think we're at least justified in assuming, that the inquisitors heard that belief from the heresy suspect, herself or himself, because it didn't match up with what the inquisitors thought that a person like Wycliffe himself would have believed. So I encourage us, and it seems that there's a movement among scholars of Lollardy or Wycliffism to adopt this point of view. I would encourage us not to throw out the records of trials, but to read them critically. And in fact, to read specifically for what Girard would have described as the unusual feature, or the feature that doesn't seem to belong there. Because as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, more often than not, we are seeing these heresy suspects or defendants through the eyes of their inquisitors. I want to make just one more point before I conclude. And this goes back to my third observation at the beginning, which is asking about what was the Wycliffites' sphere of influence. One of the challenges in studying a heresy that began in and was prominent in the British or Atlantic Isles is that I have to confront, and I've had to confront, the binary that English scholars have so often drawn between England on the one hand and the so-called continent, what today we'd call the European mainland, on the other. Of course, after the English Reformation, this distinction became related to notions of English exceptionalism or English nationalism that were passed down by Protestant propagandists like John Fox and others. And as I mentioned at the beginning, English Protestants had a strong rhetorical need to see Wycliffe and his followers as their answer to the question about where their church was before Luther. But thanks to some pioneering scholars, particularly in the Czech Republic, we now have a much richer and much fuller understanding of the relationship between Wycliffe and Wycliffism in England on the one hand, and related reform movements in the European mainland on the other. And there's a historic accident that we need to acknowledge here. King Richard II of England married Anne of Bohemia, and as a result of that marriage in the early 1380s, there was a tremendous cultural connection formed between England on the one hand and Bohemia, modern-day Czech Republic, on the other. And so the connection that developed between thinkers in the mold of Wycliffe and then thinkers in the mold of Jan Hus was not accidental at all. It followed upon these cultural and political connections that had been built between the English crown and the leadership in Bohemia. Unfortunately, during the period of the Iron Curtain, so many of the manuscripts that were held in Prague and in other Eastern European cities were not available to Western scholars. And so it's only been in the last 10 to 15 years that scholars like Pavel Sukup, for instance, from the Czech Republic, or Michael Van Dusen working in Canada, have begun to dig more deeply into those connections, to understand exactly how ideas and books and patterns of belief and patterns of worship flowed from one place to another. And what we've begun to discover is that it's important, I think, for the study of any of the heresies or heretical movements that we are here at this conference to discuss. It's important that we develop a pan-European perspective, because Wycliffism was not seen just as an English problem. It was seen as an ecclesiastical problem, and one that eventually stuck its tentacles out through Jan Hus onto the European mainland, and even into the universities of Western Europe, such as Paris. And so one of the reasons I'm so grateful to have had the opportunity to speak and to be part of the conversations at this conference is because I appreciate that the Inquire network is not leaving us locked into our local echo chambers, where those who study France, and those who study Italy. If heresy was seen as an ecclesiastical and indeed small c Catholic problem, then so also do we need to study it as such. And those of us who have made our careers focusing on the Atlantic or British Isles, I think, have our share of catching up to do, because those of you who are working on the European mainland, of course, have done this much longer already. So in conclusion, it seems to me that the Lollards or Wycliffites offer us a lens through which we can see medieval heresies more broadly. The inquisitors, or in the case of the English repression, bishops and their consistory courts, those individuals imposed their assumptions about the structures of a heretical movement, the ways in which a heretical movement might be organized. So in their imagination, John Wycliffe became a heresiarch in the same way that heresiarchs must have existed in the early church. John Wycliffe's followers were seen almost as sheep who had been led astray and who must have been deluded in exactly the same way, or who must have begun to believe exactly the same thing because of what Wycliffe had taught them. Even though, as it turns out, Wycliffe himself played only a small part in the translation of the Bible into English, and he only rarely preached his own ideas in the vernacular language. These inquisitors presumed that these so-called Wycliffites, and then subsequently their Hussites, were simply repeating the opinions of Wycliffe as if they had no personal or individual reason to process and appropriate them for themselves. And so ecclesiastical authorities didn't hesitate to impute to heresy suspects ideas about what they must have believed or why they must have believed them. It's interesting that it's only because the Wycliffites were successful in committing so many of their ideas to writings, in religious texts, both in Latin and in the vernacular language. And it's only because they were successful in saving a small number of those writings from destruction at the hands of church authorities that today we're able to correct the record. And so I hope that this survey of recent developments in the study of Wycliffism helps to stimulate our conversations at this conference with regard not just to English heresies, but to so many different religious movements which were equally condemned. Molte grazie.
Thank you, Patrick Hornbeck, for this wide picture about Wycliffe and the Wycliffite movement. Wycliffe as morning star of the Reformation, as you said, and about this need of an open wide picture of Europe and connections between Europe countries and what happens in these countries in the Middle Ages, in the late Middle Ages, in this case. Well, I think our speaker were bravi in Italian, and we have some time to discuss and for questions and discussions too. I have to remember that everybody, ones who are in Bologna, ones who are at home, everybody can raise his hand and then her hand, and we have some time to discuss about these three last contributions. The ones who are at home, they have to raise their symbolic electronic hand that way of Teams. Prego.
Now if I have to, if we can see.
Yeah, we can do that.
Okay. Thank you very much to all of you. I have a question.
Better if you speak.
I have a question to Professor Patrick, a set of questions, in fact, to Professor Patrick Hornbeck. I really appreciate your conference. I also work in Portugal with pastoral visitations performed by the bishops and episcopal courts. And I have 2 or 3 questions. First, you said that in medieval England, most part of the Lollards, they were persecuted during visitations and after, I guess, in the episcopal courts. First, do you still have full records of these trials for England? Second question, during that trials, the episcopal judges, they could apply torture? And the third question, did the episcopal justice have jurisdiction over laymen? And if so, what kind of penalties they could apply? So as you see, very simple questions, but they are important, especially for to answer and to go in the direction of your last remarks. We need to exchange lots of experiences in order to understand better this world of the persecution against terrorism. Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. And I would be eager to find out what the situation was in Portugal, although I know we may not have time just now. So to go in order, there were a number of heresy prosecutions that emerged out of episcopal visitations. What's interesting is that not every English bishop chose to undertake visitations, and even those who did, not all of them chose to emphasize the persecution of heresy or the identification of heretics. So one of the things that I didn't have time to mention in my main paper is that very often it was the individual personalities or theological views of the individual bishops that seemed to indicate whether heresy was a prominent theme on their agenda, or whether it was something they were more content to let slide. So as an example, I mentioned that in 1428, John Wycliffe's bones were dug up and burned, which was something that had been ordered by the Council of Constance in 1415. So you might wonder, why did it take 13 years to dig up and burn his bones? He was the most reviled heretic in all of Europe at that point. And the reason was that the bishop of the diocese where his bones were, at the time of the Council of Constance, was Wycliffe's former student at the University of Oxford. And it wasn't until that bishop had died and a new bishop came in that the order to burn the bones actually was followed. So whether a bishop was more inclined to be a heresy hunter or was more inclined to seek sort of a more pastoral solution, that depends a lot on the political situation. But to answer your first question, there were a number of visitations, in particular in the Diocese of Lincoln in the 1410s. There were a number of major campaigns against heresy in the Diocese of Norwich in the 1420s, and then in the Diocese of Winchester almost a century later in the 1510s and 1520s. Torture was not used, or at least was not confessed to, in the records of church courts. But there was, nonetheless, a relationship between the civil law and the canon law or ecclesiastical law at the time. So the best way that I've come to think about it was that the pursuit of heresy in late medieval England was a four-step process, 2 steps involving the church courts and 2 steps involving the crown. And so the first step was the denunciation of the individual as a heretic, and that could apply to a layperson just as much as it could to a cleric. And so a person was denounced to his or her local bishop. The local sheriff, an officer of the crown, would then be dispatched to bring that person to the church court. So the crown was involved and very actively involved in this prosecution. The proceeding would then take place at the church court, and as is common on the mainland of Europe as well, the proceeding could include the accused acknowledging his heresy, summoning what are called compurgators or character witnesses, or denying his heresy. And within the competence of the church court was a whole range of punishments, including fasting or having to wear a certain article of clothing or going on a penitential procession or any number of things like that. But if the penalty of death was imposed, which was legal in England from 1401, canon law prohibited the church from carrying out the sentence of death. And so the language that's used in these bishops' registers is that the suspect was relaxed to the secular arm for punishment, which was to say that the church surrendered control over the defendant, but knew that the crown would carry out the sentence of death. I hope that answers all 3 of your questions.
Thank you. A question for Patrick Hornbeck. Thank you very much for a very interesting, very well organized paper, easy to follow even in this very large room with kind of not the best acoustics. My more than a question is a remark and a comment on your point about the difficulty at studying the beliefs of the heretics based on hostile sources, sources produced by the institutions that were punishing, therefore were ill-disposed towards the heretic, to say the least. You were mentioning a recent article by John Arnold in Past and Present. I haven't seen that. I read Arnold's book on Unbelief in the Middle Ages, which is a great book on these issues. And then you were mentioning also a French historian or thinker about how to approach hostile sources and try to get at the root of the actual beliefs. But that reminded me of something that is kind of a classic study for anyone interested in witchcraft, the Night Battles by Carlo Ginzburg, the Benandanti, 1966. So the great lesson of that book is that, of course, you have the feeling and you can maybe touch something concrete and real from the beliefs of the people who tried themselves when you feel that scarto, that distance between the questions and the expectations of the judges on the one hand and the answer on the other hand. So perhaps we don't have to look too far to find suggestions that of course need to be updated and maybe nuanced and finessed today, but they were already there in this great intuition of a book that has opened a whole field of studies for anyone interested in the Inquisition and popular culture in the Middle Ages and early modern era. Thank you.
Thank you for that observation, and I'll reply briefly. I put the citation to John Arnold's article in the meeting chat, so perhaps if those who are interested, you can see it there. One thing that is true about Lollardy or Wycliffeism, as I mentioned, is that these individuals, or some of these individuals, wrote their own texts, and so unlike with some other heretical groups, particularly the earlier ones in let's say, France in the 11th century or 12th century, we can engage in a critical correlation between what the heresy, what those who identified as followers of Christ along Wycliffe's lines, we can look at their own words and correlate those with what the inquisitors said about them. Now, that's not a one-to-one correlation, and one of the key insights that's developed over the last 15 years is, of course, that just because one differed from the institutional church didn't mean that everybody who differed in exactly the same way. But I think it's important when we have only fragmentary information and where there's the risk of stereotype to correlate as many possible sources as we can, almost to triangulate and see if we can come as close as possible to what these people believed.
Are there some other questions? Well, if not, I think it was a very interesting article, pleasure too, and we are meeting tomorrow. For the ones who are at home, we are meeting tomorrow. Yeah, of course. For the ones who are at home, we are meeting tomorrow at 9 o'clock. In the morning, and for the other ones who are here in Bologna, there's a visit in the locals of the ancient Inquisition, of course, here in the convent, and then we are going to see dead rooms that are very interesting. So it's a pity that you are not in Bologna, but next time maybe we can do it all together. Thank you very much, and we see you tomorrow.